So Brian, you're going to have to unmute when the time comes, and if you will. So anyway, this is fantastic. It's our pleasure tonight to hear from Brian Murphy, and it's our sixth in this continuous 67 Zoom series. And last month we came to you from the East Coast, and this month we're coming to you from the West Coast. And next month we'll be coming to you from all over the country with past Peace Corps classmates. And in fact, they'll be telling you about the great fun they had all over the world. So tonight we're going to go back to the original format we had with Brian speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll go to small group breakout sessions for 15 minutes and then come back for questions. John Huffnagel is backing me up as co-host, and hopefully our technical skills will not let us down when we go to breakout rooms. Let me give a little formal introduction to Brian, and then I'll give a little informal introduction. Briefly, as a formal introduction, Brian is President Emeritus of De Anza College and Associate in Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education. Brian taught political theory and urban politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Santa Clara University, and San Francisco State University. Brian received master's and doctoral degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. In 2011, Brian co-founded the Democracy Commitment, of which he'll be speaking to us tonight, a coalition of community college to foster civic engagement. Brian is recognized as setting a national standard for educational excellence, a comprehensive commitment to social justice, and an overarching focus on civic engagement, service training, learning, and most importantly, an engagement with the practical arts of democracy. Excuse me, Brian, if you see me smiling a bit in this part of the introduction, because social justice, civic engagement, service learning, most of us would think of these as rather benign concepts. However, I must tell our classmates that one group has singled out Brian in particular, and many institutes of higher education in general, as threats to the proper teaching of civics. The American Association of Scholars labels itself as a group dedicated to restoring American education to its former glory. In January 2017, a 525-page diatribe, the American Association of Scholars labels the Democracy Commitment as a group advocating new civics. It states, and I quote, "Civic education properly understood aims for a flourishing of the individual rather than a forced and pervasive commitment to the community." It seems our friend and classmate, Brian Murphy, continues to shake up the academic status quo. And as with apologies to the American Association of Scholars, our classmate Brian Murphy has flourished as an individual and also has a passionate commitment to the communities he serves and to the American democracy he's a part of. So Brian, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I'll spare you the truth about the American Association of Scholars. It's a front organization for a couple of other organizations, but be that as it may, the notoriety gained from the American Association of Scholars pales in comparison to my 15 minutes of fame on a notorious talk show that will go nameless, where I was assailed as, I don't know whether I was just a fool or a knave as well. Let me set this up in a particular way. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the community colleges, and then in that context, talk about the civic engagement within them, and more generally use that as a way of just sort of prompting some reflection on all of our part about the role higher education plays in fostering, protecting, defending democracy. And I would stipulate the particular passage we're in now is one in which democracy needs protection. And we could argue or talk about that later. The setup basically is to talk first, as I said, about the community colleges and kind of give us a situation. But could we do a show of hands here? And this is not one of these setup questions where I know the answer in advance. I really would like to know, by a show of hands, how many of us ourselves have either attended a course at a community college or have children who attended community colleges? Yeah, a handful, but not many, a handful. So at the risk of, sort of annoying those of you who are much more familiar than others with the community colleges, I want to give you some sense of the magnitude of the operation. The two-year public community colleges are a uniquely American invention. They exist in this particular way that they do here almost nowhere else in the world. They enroll, to give you some sense of the magnitude of the enterprise, the two-year colleges in the United States, of which there are about 1,100 of them, enroll roughly 45% of all undergraduate enrollment in the United States. 50% of all of the graduates of the comprehensive universities, that is to say, not the research ones, but the comprehensive state universities, 50% of all of their graduates are community college transfers. University of California, as a Research One university, 1/3 of all of its graduates are transfers from the community colleges. So the enterprise is both vast and part of a very, very significant mobility function, because the community colleges are the gateway institution for the majority of immigrant students, the vast majority of low-income students, and the majority of non-white students in the United States. Roughly 48% of all students graduating from all colleges and universities attended a community college. And that number is heavily shifted towards the poor, as I said, immigrants and non-white persons. The demography of the community colleges, as you all probably know, are dramatically different than the demography of the class we are part of when we were in college. There is no one modal age. God knows they are not all between the ages of 18 and 22. It's extraordinarily diverse with regard to age, extraordinarily diverse range of persons. Roughly 2/3 of the students who are enrolled in community colleges work. More than 1/3 have families. And in the college that I was associated with, De Anza College, for about 14 years, that demography was, the demography of our campus reflected the demography of our region. Roughly 3,000 of our 23,000 students were Latino. About 3,500 were Asian Americans, about 3,000 white Americans. There's an enormously diverse student body. Now, let me just sort of play around with a few other things to situate the community colleges in the structure of American higher education. The magnitude is enormous. If you segment it out, Research One, comprehensive, small private colleges, none of them collectively match the enrollment of the community colleges. So they are by far the largest sector of higher education in the United States. They are also, by any magnitude you want to reckon with, the least funded per capita. Secondly, in the status hierarchy that defines American higher education, Williams would be almost exactly at the top, and my college would be very near the bottom. Status is determined in American higher education by the number and quality of persons you do not accept, the number and quality or perceived quality of persons you turn down. It's called selectivity, so that Stanford and Harvard and Williams can, in their promotional materials, claim their specialness based on the percentage of applicants who get in. The smaller the percentage, presumably, the better the school. So that a place like De Anza and American community colleges, they advertise, if they think about it this way, we accept the top 100%. Now, if you think of my own personal career, I was saying this to Larry when we were talking about this presentation. I went from Williams to Berkeley to teach at Santa Cruz, at Santa Clara, San Francisco State, and ended up at De Anza. My career was straight downhill from the most elite institution, arguably the finest in the country, to the most diverse, least status institution. Now, seen from that lens, you know, poor thing me. But my own living experience was that I was unprepared, given that history. I was really seriously unprepared for the quality of mind, the commitment of intellect and spirit that I discovered at De Anza College. 85% of our students came to college lacking college level mathematics or English compositional skills. Wrap your head around that. 85% show up, enroll, lacking mathematics skills or English compositional skills that you would take for granted at any four-year institution. So seen through those lenses, these students are either the victim or the bystanders of an underfunded public educational system. They disproportionately are showing the effects of poverty and underfunded public schools. They are, in the sort of language of higher education, poor things, characterized by many deficits. In the language of higher ed, it's a deficit model. And the job of a place is to fill the deficits, compensate for the shortfalls, and move them along. At De Anza, what I discovered was an entirely different way of looking at the students, an entirely different way of looking at our project, if you will. 72% of the students at De Anza are fluently bilingual, many trilingual. They have navigated the indignities of racism and bureaucratic stupidity for their lives in ways that we would have a difficult time imagining. If they are immigrant, they have crossed 2 or 3 or 4 borders. They code shift every day of their lives between the languages required of the bureaucracy of the school, of the public and official places, the language of their neighborhood, of their family, the affective centers of their lives. And they do this with uncommon grace and fluidity and speed. They are stunningly smart. Their SAT scores, if we ever required them, would no doubt suck. But their ability to do the work is astonishing. If the faculty engages them from their strengths and says of them, I am not meeting those poor and benighted souls I'm supposed to serve, I am instead engaging men and women who have each chosen to drive 40 minutes across Silicon Valley to get themselves from their home to our campus and stay in school. No one's required to go to college. 2/3 of our students work. Parenthetically, half of our students lost jobs in the first month of the pandemic, just to give you a sense of one dimension of their lives. So in thinking about the students and their lives, the students and their families and their communities, the question is, what's our project? What's our purpose? The easy and conventional purpose is the same as any other college and university. Prepare these young people to move and live comfortably in the world. To prepare them as citizens, to prepare them as members of the workforce, to prepare them as competent and capable people of navigating what is often a hostile and difficult social economic environment. The typical lens through which the community colleges are viewed, and I would say sadly, most of higher education is these days viewed, is the lens of vocation and workforce. Vocation and workforce. So that my students are told that their job is to prepare themselves uniquely and often singularly for work. I think it was maybe the fourth or fifth year that I was the president at De Anza. We had the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, came in to give the commencement speech. And I'll spare you the story on how I got him. But in any event, he came and he gave the talk, and he looked out on this sea of faces that was the full, the full diversity of the Silicon Valley region, which is not characterized by Palo Alto and Stanford, but by San Jose and Union City and Fremont and the other communities that make up the broader Silicon Valley region. And he complimented them for representing the workforce of the future. They were the diverse workforce that Obama knew was the future of the country, you know, the usual complimentary things. And I was pissed because I knew at exactly the same time some deputy undersecretary of commerce was speaking at Stanford University, and I guarantee you she was not telling them that they were going to be the workforce of the future. No, they were the leaders of the future. They were the ones upon which the future of at least technical companies depended. I ran into one of our students, Iranian immigrant student, a linebacker on the football team, an enormous man, Mohammed, known affectionately by Mo, by his buddies. I said, "How'd you like the speech?" And he said, "It was all right." I said, "What do you mean it's all right? That was the Secretary of Education, for God's sake." And he looked at me and he said, "You know, I didn't come to college to compete with the Chinese. I read the Sufi poets in the original Persian. I'd like somebody to appreciate that." Sorry, you know, wrong speaker for you. The lens of vocationalism is the lens through which I would argue most community colleges are seen, and almost all of higher education to boot. I have a friend who teaches at Stanford who says, not condescendingly, but with a certain amount of sadness, he said, "Look, you know, we've become a great vocational school. They all want to go into computer science. They don't come here to learn, they come here to network." So it's not unique to our sector, this kind of relentless focus on work. There isn't a single student at De Anza, particularly who's poor, who has any confusion whatsoever that they need to have work. No one needs to alert them to the fact that they've got to be competitive in a difficult job market. But what they also need is the capacity to be politically active and engaged, to be publicly involved, to be able to analyze, think about, understand, act with regard to the structures of power that actually affect their lives. And those structures are political and social and cultural, not uniquely vocational and having only to do with the market. And the democracy commitment grew out of a recognition among many of us across the country that our students were being systematically condescended to, and that American civic education, insofar as it was then a national movement marked by offices of service learning across the country, had by and large bypassed the community colleges. And the democracy commitment was born of a commitment on the number of our parts, and some really, really cool people who I came to know over those years. Eduardo Padron at Miami-Dade was probably the biggest national leader, but people out of Appalachia and Texas and Colorado and Oregon, all over the country. There were chancellors and presidents and deans and thousands of faculty who were looking for ways to have their students learn about the public and political world upon which, in fact, their futures would largely depend. I'll use one example. All right, there's a study done by the University of California at Santa Cruz economist Chrisbrenner on what had mattered the most in the material conditions of working people in Silicon Valley. And he analyzed just about every market development that he could think of over a decade and determined that the single most important change in Silicon Valley, which had affected the lives of working men and women, was the passage of a living wage act or ordinance in San Jose, which lifted the minimum wage to $15 an hour and had been the single most significant increase in wages in a region not marked by strength in unions. Nothing else had mattered as much. No appeals to the moral sensibilities of the Silicon Valley wealth had had any effect whatsoever. This campaign to get the living wage had been engaged in by ordinary men and women throughout the region. And it really mattered to our students who had participated in that campaign, many of them, to get this kind of academic report that showed that this kind of work had mattered, and it had mattered to their neighbors, to their families, to their friends, for themselves. So when you do this, when you reach the conclusion that you should be thinking more broadly than just the vocational track, what do? So I'll talk for a few minutes. I'm mindful it's about 4:20. I'll talk for a few minutes about what we actually did at De Anza. And I'll spare you all of the details, but I approached the process of engaging the campus the way you would approach any organizing task if you were a community organizer. Where are the centers of power? Who has influence? Where do people, so who really matters in the informal culture of the place? And I need to be really, really clear. I came to a place that was already an astonishingly good school. It wasn't anything I did that changed that. De Anza and Santa Monica College have the highest transfer rates in the state of California. Our students transfer to the University of California. They graduate sooner, they have higher GPAs, they do better than so-called native freshmen at the University of California. Which is to say that the students who come from very, very different social backgrounds than many of those students who go to a great university like Berkeley as freshmen, when they are joined as juniors by transfer students from Berkeley City College and Laney College and De Anza College, there are 11 community colleges in the Bay Area, they are joined by highly motivated, very thoughtful young people. I once asked a dean, a friend of mine at Santa Clara University, how do you know our transfer students? She said, oh, we know all about the De Anza students. I said, yeah, well, how? And she said, well, I'll tell you, they all know how to write. They do the work, and it's the damnedest thing. They actually expect you to show up for office hours. I mean, what that's actually about is a faculty who engage them as full human beings with complex lives and are thoughtful and flexible and you know, to return to the earliest thing, Larry, nobody's locking the door at De Anza. If you show up late, you might be 40 minutes late for an hour-long class. Something else went on. It wouldn't be good if we found out what went on. So we tried to build in the curriculum a set of interventions and pedagogies that built upon the skills our students brought. Forget politics out there for the moment. Forget public policy and living wage campaigns or other stuff. Given their skills, given their capacities, what could we do to build on those rather than neglect them, ignore them, take them for granted? And we built a set of cohort programs led principally by a group of Latino faculty who created a project called Latino Empowerment at De Anza, LEAD. And in it, they structured courses into what they called familia. A familia is a group of 8 to 10 students led by a peer mentor, someone who took the class last year, unpaid, I'd like to point out. And those persons work together on class projects, and they work with each other on their individual homework, et cetera, et cetera. They take responsibility for each other. And when you ask, well, what does that actually mean? What it means in a familia is that if we have a collective project and Larry, you show up John shows up, Harry shows up, but Lenny doesn't. The next morning, I'm texting Lenny, you're showing up at his house. We want to know what's going on, right? And if the child support didn't get paid or there was an abusive situation, then we got to get some help and figure out how we can get you the assistance you might not otherwise know about. The success rates in those classes were 90%. That's to say, students leaving the class with a C or better, being able to go on to the next level. I asked a young student once, parenthetically, the enrollment in this was in no way exclusively Latino. It was all kind of students. And I met with a group of them once, and one of the familia, and this young Sikh kid was telling me about his experience. And I said, naively, as if I didn't know, why don't you just call it a work group? Why do you call it a familia? He looked at me very seriously and he said, well, you know, it's like a family. You don't choose them, but by God, you're obligated to them. You might not even like them. And he'd been taking everybody in that group. He'd been taking them to his Sikh temple and showing them what that was. And then, you know, he'd never been in a Catholic church. And so one of the other folks took him to her church to show him what that looked like. And it sounds kind of hokey, but this view of our students as being uniquely competent as members of families, of members of extended families and large communities, of having skills and capacities that no one in it, with all due respect, almost no one in an admissions office at Williams would be asking about. It wouldn't be in the metrics that would show up on an application. But it was in the living experience of our students' lives. And so we tried to build pedagogical programs that drew on those strengths. We then built entire learning communities, sort of grouping of courses around themes. We created a first year experience of multiple themes, trying to group students together so that the enemy, the loneliness, the isolation that any individual student experiences can be compensated for by sort of surrounding them with what I think many of us at Williams took for granted in the dorms, you know, in our living circumstances. We were all from elsewhere. We were all lonely and alone. And you had sort of Rich Gehrman and I and John Gladney there. We had each other within 6 minutes of meeting each other. And that's missing in a commuter school where there are no dorms, people are largely on their own. And so you try to create a social community. And then we built an Institute for Democracy, which means you take staff and money and you invest in it. We had tenured members of the faculty leading it. And the function of the Institute for Democracy was to find internship opportunities, what would be known elsewhere. We don't tend to use the word service, and we don't use the word service learning. And there's a long ideological background to that, but we regard it as engagement rather than service, partly because men and women are working with either their own community or communities very much like theirs around common problems. And we built a network of partnerships with community-based nonprofits in the Silicon Valley, and they range from sort of Friends of the Urban Forest to literacy campaigns to immigration campaigns, almost none of it explicitly political. The opportunity to get engaged in political campaigns or the living wage campaign, that sort of comes organically out of a context in which students are looking for ways to have an impact in the lives of their communities. So that after about a decade, one could look at any social movement of any consequence in Silicon Valley, whether it was housing, transportation, rent control, wage equity. De Anza students were involved in it. To a degree that surprised the trade unionists who weren't used to college students getting involved. It surprised people in the business sector, not in a scary way, they weren't used to college students showing up for coalition meetings on equitable transit. When was the last time college students cared about equitable transit? Well, it turns out you got dozens of students on a campus doing mapping projects and trying to figure out how to lobby. And over a 3-year process, to give you an example, our students successfully lobbied for free bus transportation for college students and for rerouting bus lines to make it easier to get from one side of the valley to the other. I should have said this earlier. There's a social contradiction built into my story, parenthetically. De Anza is in Cupertino, California, one of the richest suburbs on God's earth, right? But 10% of our students come from Cupertino. The vast majority of our 23,000 students come from elsewhere, not the local neighborhood. And so there's an eerie disjuncture between the community in which the college happens to be located, which is in a very affluent, comfortable suburb, and the lives of students, and how they traverse that terrain is part of what the students have to become self-conscious about. So they have active conversations about that difference, let me put it that way. And with surprising generosity and openness, trying to understand why are the lives of some of my classmates so different from mine. But it also means for the middle class students or the Cupertino students who are there, many of them are confronting their own privilege for the first time in their lives. They're really having to think about that. I had a wonderful transfer student, an Indo-American student, whose mother candidly was really pissed off that she'd chosen De Anza College rather than going directly to college. She didn't want to leave home. She didn't feel she was ready. And so she spent 2 years. She was an incredibly smart young woman. And her mother came to me at graduation and said, you know, she's transferring to Georgetown. And I said, yes, I do know that. And she said, well, I was very opposed to her coming to De Anza. I didn't tell her I'd heard that, but I just said, oh, okay. And she leaned in and she said, but you know, you did a really good job and you saved me $100,000. The young woman came back and she said to me, when she was visiting campus, and she said, you know, I spent 2 years at De Anza grappling with my own social standing, the fact that I had more than my classmates and my own privilege. And I really had to be thoughtful about that. She said, but I soon learned at Georgetown that what I thought was privilege, well, by golly, there's a whole bunch of people with one hell of a lot more privilege than I have. I'd never met them before. The bottom line was and is the democracy commitment had at its height about 140 colleges across the country. Each of them were committed to the idea that a student should have the opportunity to learn what we called the practical skills of democracy. Far from the ideological critique of the American Association of Scholars, it was not some indoctrination camp. It was an effort to say to students that if we take your life seriously, and we're going to, you are going to be in an environment where having skills in addition to the obvious vocational skills you will need, and having the personal capacity to understand how power operates and confront it when you have to is going to matter to you a very great deal. And over again, students, whether they are the Allegheny College of Maryland, small little college, community college in Cumberland, Maryland, their students started the first public awareness, public education campaign around OxyContin. In Miami-Dade, in a deeply conservative community, the students undertook one of the most aggressive voter education campaigns anybody had ever seen. In Arlington, Texas, the students at Tarrant County Community College registered and voted 10,000 additional students in what is the reddest district in the state of Texas. So in the end, my adventure, if you will, coming from the environment that all of you and I shared together at Williams, where I look with deep affection and respect back to Frank Oakley and Bob Gaudino and the faculty who engaged me and pushed me and didn't let me be too comfortable. I think about that, and then I think to myself, damn it, you could have as well been teaching others too. I would love to have any of those faculty have to deal with the complexity of the students with which we dealt. I served 1 year as a teaching assistant for one of our political theory professors, partly because I just missed the classroom and I wanted to know what it was like. And to be honest, the students, again, they could care less what my title was. I was just the guy at the end of the table who was asking all these annoying questions. And if you imagine yourself teaching American democracy and sitting in your classroom are first generation immigrant students from El Salvador, Guatemala, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the People's Republic of China, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Cupertino. That's a real different conversation than the ones we had when we were engaged with each other at Williams College. And I'm better or worse. I'm just saying it's a very, very different conversation. And the challenge for the faculty is how do you engage that differential experience with the differential skills and the different sort of comfort levels that students have? It is infuriating to me to hear the current dialogue about ideological monotheism in the American civic engagement movement when my living experience in the classroom is one of generosity and engagement and thoughtfulness, and a faculty whose skills are astonishing. I mean, I found myself very ill-equipped in many ways to know what questions to ask and how to navigate a conversation. And when somebody is really pissed off about somebody else, how to bring it back down into some kind of civil exchange. But our faculty do it every single day, and I really am admiring of them. Final thing I'll say is this, which is that I think American democracy is in trouble. I think it faces an existential crisis. I think that any prudent person knows that we're the only advanced democracy in the known world that has one of its two major parties opposed to most democratic acts or actions. That's called voting. I mean, I think it's a very difficult time, and I don't think it's uniquely about Donald Trump. I think the country faces a crisis in its demography as it transitions from a kind of monocultural past to a deeply multicultural future. It was always multicultural, but always stratified. And if you're living now in a state like California, the stratification still exists, but the political representation is shifting. So the meaning of being in a community in which you're sharing power with persons who don't look like you, who don't speak the same language you speak, at least initially, those dynamics, as unsettling as they are for a lot of folks, nonetheless are necessary to confront. The final thing I'll say, everybody talks about the transfer rates and the success rates, and trust me, if you get that right, you can do a lot of other very good things in these colleges. It is true, you got to get that right, the transfer and the GPAs and persistence rates and all the rest of it. But in our polling of students when they graduate, the single most important element that 95% of the students identify, if not the most important, one of the 2 or 3 most important things they got at the college was how to work collaboratively with people who don't look like me. In a society as stratified and as segregated as ours is, that's a good thing to have that as one of your outcomes. But getting it as one of your outcomes is a piece of work. It doesn't happen just sort of automatically. I could go on, but I think I'll stop. I think I went too long anyway. My God, I hit your 40-minute thing right on the nail.
Brian, you're exceptional. thank you very much for challenging us to think and for our brains. And if I get this right, I'm going to have to do a little bit of work here, but I think I've got it all set up to do breakout rooms correctly. And in each room, hopefully, I put a facilitator: Alan Stern, John Vipon, John Huffnagel, Ken Wilcox, Harry Tether, Brian Murphy, and Ron Bodenson. Since you're going to be leading next time, I've got you in a room as facilitator. Brian has asked us to consider in our meetings 2 questions, the following topics. What have your experiences been with community college? He asked about people going or others, but any experiences you've had. And after Brian's talk, does your former thoughts about community colleges line up with what Brian was talking about? So just before and after. And second, if American democracy faces an existential threat, as many of us believe, what more can higher education do to combat this threat? So those are 2 topics for your consideration. I am making sure that we come back in 15 minutes. I think I've got the breakout rooms, if I look at this, that you will automatically go in without having to do anything. And let me just make sure you're coming back in 15 minutes, and I'll give you a notice. I think I've got it. You'll be sent to breakout rooms automatically. Welcome back. The college gives us about to 7:15 or 7:20. So I know Huff wants to make an announcement about reunion at the end, but I just want to tell everybody while they're all here, before we open it up for comments or questions, which we can use hand raising under the reaction button or the participant button. The next Zoom meeting is on November 18th. And as I said, it's going to be a number of our classmates who are going to talk about their time in the Peace Corps. And then coming attractions in January, we're going to be talking about some of the athletic participants, and namely a lot of the captains and our mentors as coaches, and then go into breakout rooms and talk about your mentors at the college. And in February, we're going to have some of our classmates that have attempted or have written fiction to talk about their fiction adventures. So a lot in store. So questions or comments that came out of the breakout rooms, or questions to Brian? I'll look for hand raising, and Huff, you can look for actual people waving. Any questions or comments that anybody wants to make?
Viper's got a question.
Go ahead, unmute and go right ahead.
Larry, I just because I'm up here in the corner and supposedly a moderator, there were 2 points by folks that are much smarter than I, as most of all of you are. The distinguished Dr. Samuels and the distinguished Mr. Lang, essentially in terms of what can Williams College do to bridge the gap, to reach out, have connections of some sort with the community college system. I get the sense that very few of us have had much contact with community colleges. Nick Lang also said, at what cost should Williams put part of its significant endowment towards such an effort? So those are the questions. Brian, what do you think?
You have to unmute, Brian.
Thank you. I was for a number of years on the Gaudino Fund board with Steve Block and a few other friends, and that question came up, or I asked it there, and I had one disheartening conversation with an admissions officer regarding whether or not Williams would be interested in a significant increase in their transfer population. And when students at De Anza are looking for a place to transfer, I mean, 900 of them transfer to San Jose State, but hundreds of them transfer to the University of California, and there's about 50 go to Santa Clara. There's always a few, 12, 15, 20, 25, 30, that go to Eastern schools. The larger privates like the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, accept more transfer students. The smaller ones, with the exception of Swarthmore, the smaller ones like Williams almost accept none. And almost all the transfers they accept are transfers from other schools like them. A refugee from Amherst, that kind of thing. And the common explanation is we want students to have what they call the whole Williams experience. That must have been said to me 3 or 4 times. So the idea that students from the community colleges in Adams or Pittsfield or any of the local community colleges would have something to add to the campus. I mean, genuinely add to the campus. That never came up. Were there to be an initiative, I think the local community colleges would probably really welcome it. Because they're looking for talent and they're looking for, they're looking for a place for their talent to go. But it takes a college being willing to really, you got to create the infrastructure for inclusion, and really thinking positively. The final comment I'll say is Williams had a failed effort a number of years ago. They had a particular relationship with one high school in the Salinas Valley in California, and they were accepting 2 or 3 Latino students a year from the same high school. And those students, they did reasonably well. I actually talked with the admissions people about it, and they said, well, we knew that students, if they came isolated and alone, they weren't going to do as well. They needed to have somebody with them. This was as freshmen, right? So therefore, we're accepting 3 or 4 from this one school because at least they have some friends to come with them. Well, that same logic would have to appear, I think, for a transfer program, to think of not just accepting one, but a group and saying, well, how would we integrate new students? We're by and large going to be scholarship students. The college will be a new environment for them.
George Cannon, I think you had your hand up, and then Ted, and did Lenny Goldberg leave? I saw his hand up, but I'll catch him if he's still around. Go ahead, George. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Yeah.
George?
Yes. Brian, I was wondering, in your program, is there a specific curriculum or do you just suggest this ideas to the schools and they just do whatever they want within their classes? I'm not really clear on how specific it is. Or are there actual classes in democracy, or do you just promote some sort of a general attitude that people are going to be more involved in, I think you didn't call it service, but commitment to community or something like that?
Each of the community colleges involved in the democracy commitment had very different programs depending upon their local circumstance, their own staffing, etc. At De Anza, it meant that in the social sciences, the obvious ones, political science, sociology, history, the faculty were actively looking for ways for their students to be involved in group projects based in the community. It didn't mean changing the content of what they were teaching as much as looking for a way to emphasize the notions of mutual responsibility and community. On the other hand, we had an Institute for Democracy that actually has an 18-unit course sequence that's accredited by the state for transfer called Social Justice Leadership. And it's essentially a certificate program in community organizing, but also a heavy degree of sort of self-consciousness. I'm using that term in the positive way. Self-care would be another way of doing it. This can be hard, difficult work. So how do you take care of yourself? How do you not get burned out? Stuff like that. So that involves sociology, philosophy, and psychology. The professors come from that perspective. In one of the programs in Minneapolis, there's an entire undergraduate major in community economic development, which is a field and has a normal curriculum, et cetera. And the community college provides the first 2 years. They transfer into the second 2 years from Minneapolis College to Metropolitan State. And so their transfer students come in fully geared up. And that's very focused on the question of equitable economic development and how do you do it in a city, and who are the players and how does it work. So it varies enormously place by place. One of the things we were determined to do, this makes the ideological critique of us really silly, was to have no one particular model, was to say, let there be many, many models. Let's learn from each other. What people do in Texas is different than what we do in California. So
we'll try to get to as many as we can. Ted, you're next, then Lenny, then Ron. Ted McPherson on mute.
hey, Ted.
Hey, Brian, in our breakout group, everyone was universally complimentary to your impact as a practitioner in deploying what works in education in scale. You talked about an institution that had 23,000 students, and we're familiar with California system, Florida, Texas, and so forth. So it's been, you've really had a tremendous impact. The question that we would like to hear just a bit more about was not to challenge your view, but to think, to be clarified as to why democracy is so threatened in your view.
I think there are three tendencies that we're all familiar with. There's an astonishing level of what I'd call civic illiteracy in the United States. And that ranges from the almost caricatured lack of geographic understanding. 18% of Americans can identify Afghanistan on the map, that kind of thing. But more importantly, 45% can't name the three branches of government. Something like 70% of people can't name their own representatives. So, it's sort of just basic lack of knowledge. And that's the result of 40 years of systematically underfunding civics in the high schools, in elementary and high schools. So there's that one just sort of base thing. Secondly, I think that the cultural pressure on students at all levels and in all environments to focus only on their own careers and their own lives, to be successful in the nominal terms of success, isolates them from community and makes it less likely that they'll engage politically. So there's a lot of dissociation and distance from the political process. Politics is corrupt. I don't want to be involved at any level. So it's kind of distancing that goes on. A lot of reasons for that. And third, I do think that the contemporary Republican Party is a threat to democracy explicitly. Whatever it meant, when Lenny and I worked in the California State Legislature, we worked in very collaborative, bipartisan ways with our Republican colleagues. And they really just genuinely, that has disappeared. And so that now that such a huge percentage of people believe the big lie, are prepared to cast doubt upon the basic facts of an election. And the fact that the Republican Party's survival as an essentially white party depends upon suppressing the vote of non-white people. And that's their agenda, and it has explicitly been that agenda. So you can imagine, I'm saying all of this in a way that's very different than what I would be able to say if I were still the president of a public institution speaking at the local Rotary Club, where I'm supposed to be scrupulously nonpartisan. So one of the difficulties is, how do you teach politics if democracy itself is now partisan? Because in 19 states, there are suppressions of the vote that's one-sided. It's not both sides are doing it. And so I think that is a real problem. Now if, Cheney and the others miraculously bring the Republican Party back to some semblance of a kind of normal conservative party, then that would be a different thing. But I would be dishonest if I didn't say honestly that I think that is a proximate problem.
Lenny, I can ask all of you, I think we can stay, John may know. I think if Brian is willing to stay longer than, let me see, what's your time out there, Brian?
It's 10
You're
after 5.
at 5:10.
I'm cool till 5:30 whenever you guys.
Okay. If you guys, people want to stay after, I'll let John talk after Lenny has his question, then we'll keep going to questions as Brian stay. Lenny, unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, Brian and I have shared many of these things. Like we're lifelong friends from Williams College, so that's been very nice. I have two things. One, to reflect the group, Brian, and they were really curious as to what you think about the discussions in the Biden bill relative to both including free community college and now jettisoning it in terms of federal policy. And the thing I was also going to ask is, which I know the answer to, but others don't. Cupertino is the home of Apple, one of the largest corporations in the entire world. So I wonder what as president of the college, what your relationship was to Apple. But I think the other question is probably much more interesting.
Well, repeat it.
The free community college part of the Biden bill, and it's both.
I find myself. I'm in a kind of outlier position at a sort of at a symbolic level. Everybody I know in the community college world supports the idea of free community college, but the God's honest truth is, in California, it's essentially free. If what you're talking about is tuition. Tuition at most is $1,500 a year, and there are fee waivers for the vast majority of our students. So to make a big deal out of it being free in California would be a bit of a misnomer. What students need help with is transportation and housing, far larger expenses than tuition costs. Now, there are states where the tuition costs are quite high, and there free community college would be an enormous social intervention. So I'm sad to see that it exited the bill. I didn't know I'd elected Joe Manchin president, but okay. So they're now going to be debating that. I'll just say two quick things about the Apple. Yes, Apple's Apple's about a mile and a half from my campus. And we have long, complex relationships with Apple. The New York Times did, as you will recall, the New York Times did this major expose on tax avoidance schemes that Apple had entered into. It was written by a business editor named Charles Duhigg. Dianza and I was featured on the front page of that story because he chose our college as the underfunded public institution living in the shadow of Apple, and came and interviewed us about public funding and all the rest of it. And so at the end of the interview, he said to me, "Do you receive philanthropy from Apple?" And I said, "Absolutely. Every year. We are beneficiaries of their philanthropy." And he said, "Do you mind if I ask you how much you receive from them each year?" And I said, "No, we're a public institution. All of it is transparent. We receive $5,000 a year from Apple Corporation." And he literally burst out laughing, as did the photographer doing the thing. And he said, "Look, do you want me to make this on background only? I wouldn't want to risk your chance at 10,000." And the truth is that one of Lenny, your and my friends chaired the Apple Foundation for a brief moment that it lived, and then they shut it down. So the answer is far broader than Apple Corporation. The entire high-tech sector is ideologically committed to the lowest tax they can possibly pay. And what that means in a place like Silicon Valley is that the inequalities between private and public education, private and publicly funded services, let's put it that way, is growing, is very, very large. I have a very cordial relations with Apple's governmental affairs guy, with whom we have lively conversations quite frequently. And their position is pretty straightforward, which is they serve their shareholders and they serve what they believe is the future of the world through technology. And that saddens me because I think it's short-sighted, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think it's uniquely about them at all. I think
We've got a few people leaving, and before I go on to other questions, John Huffnagel, you still here? I can't see you on my screen. Do you want to talk about reunion briefly? Or did we lose him? Oh, well, I can't give you the details. Only he has them. So
Huff, you're muted.
Oh, you see
John's
Huff.
talking, but he's muted.
Huff, you're muted. Are you there?
he's there, but he is mute.
Does he know how to get to the muted button?
He's saying he can't.
Okay.
He's not muted, but his voice isn't working.
Well, he has trouble with his computer. So we'll go. He'll get to us next time around on the where things stand. Ron Bodenson, go ahead.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm unmuted. Two
Okay.
quick questions. One from the group, which is, have you been able to track in any way whether your graduated students have participated in democracy, such as running for office or participate in some more formal way? And my question, which they didn't want me to ask, was, did you ever think about naming your program Students for Democratic Society?
We drive motorcycles.
Your past comes back to get you, Brian.
Been there, done that.
Thank you, Ron.
Yes, we do. We do track. We do track our graduates if they run for elected office and if they happen to be successful in that kind of way. But we're actually sort of more interested in looking at the longer trajectory of their community involvement and their what I might call their grassroots work. But yeah, no, they're members of the legislature, came to the college, et cetera, et cetera.
Brian, I'm surprised you didn't mention when you were talking about Apple, one cool fact that Steve Wozniak, the urban myth is, got kicked out of the University of Colorado after 1 year for hacking the system, which is not true. He actually was afraid to go back to the University of Colorado because he had spent so much of the computer sciences department's money. And seriously, and where did he go? He went to De Anza, and I believe Jobs also went to De Anza for a short period of time. Am I correct on that?
I think I think if Jobs was there, it was for a couple of weeks, and then he left. Wozniak was a student, and in fact gave us one of the two prototypes that they built in their whatever garage they were famously building it in, and we have it in some revered glass case where people can come by and look at it. And Wozniak he's a trip. If you've got his number, you can actually call his number and this is Woz. Where's your handler?
Rick Ackerley, you're next in line. Just unmute and ask your question.
I think I'm on mute. Well, first, Brian, wonderful job, and thank you very much. And when you were giving your three reasons for the rise of, well, I guess we'd have to say the rise of fascism in the United States, I wanted to add something from my K-12 point of view, which is that the American public school system is the culture of the American public schools is still more or less, from like 75 to 90% of the schools, 100 to 150 years old. And it was designed as a social sorting device. And so a good 70, I'm not surprised that 70 million Americans who learned in fourth grade that they were stupid are kind of pissed off about that. And that's just something I wanted to add from my point of view.
I think that the origins of the rage that we see experienced by people who feel very marginalized in the culture and society and feel neglected, et cetera, is now mobilized in a fairly serious way. And, you know, one of the old union lines is, when do you talk and when do you fight? And so, you know, between elections, there's times to talk, and then there's times to win. And higher education is organized to talk. I mean, that's sort of what it's about. And that means that you're not going to see, honestly, despite the right-wing critique of critical race theory, you're not going to find activism coming out of higher education. You will see activism coming from the students. They'll be deeply involved in the next by-elections and in the election in 24. And that's not because of anything that the colleges are doing curricularly. It's because of their own sense of their own futures being at risk and climate change and, you know, like that. I think you raise an important question that a place like Williams, I've had this conversation with one of Williams's presidents, with Francis Oakley, and only with Oakley, which if the social function of an institution, forget its professed belief, if social function is to maintain the status of and privilege of those who have come to it, how do those persons who graduate from it move the institution to be more engaged in a more equitable set of futures, whether it's climate change and stuff like that? I mean, you have to notice the degree to which how many of our classmates did what I would call deeply progressive social work that mattered, whether it was in education or health or Lenny's work in the California legislature. I mean, a lot of people did a lot of really good work. But the institution as a whole, I don't think has made a very clear, or isn't explicit, let's put it that way, about the social role it plays. But it's not alone. I think that there is an enormous sorting mechanism, as you put it. Williams is at the tail end of that sorting mechanism. I guess what I wanted to say about the community colleges, and this is a plea for all of you, because I'll bet every single one of you live in a community where there's a community college. Some of them are pretty good. There's some of them that aren't very good. You know, there's some that are more engaged, others that aren't. But they stand against that social sorting if they're doing their work right. Because it's not just they're providing a second chance or something like that. They're a place of respect for persons who come from a variety of backgrounds, and that deserves support.
Yeah.
Greg, you're going to have the last question, because fortunately or unfortunately, we're running out of the college's time.
I'm back on too, Larry.
Well, why don't you quickly go before Greg goes, and then we'll end it up.
Just wanted to invite all of you back to Reunion, which is June 9th to the 12th next year. The college is going to have an actual reunion. We will be at Dodd House. The price is going to be $100 per person and takes you all of your meals from Thursday night all the way through to Sunday brunch. We're going to have some programming too as a class, and we will be getting together as a class, but we will be with the other classes post 50 at Dodd House. They'll have a tent, is what I was told today. So we will be outside if there are some issues. But college housing is also provided, $80 a person. And when you get the reunion packet, you can sign up for college housing. If you haven't signed up or found housing and want to come back, I would say to work on that right now, Larry, and see what people can do. Because I know some people have tried and had some difficulties. I think it was one of the places, there's several places that are still available though. So get out there and take a look. And we'd love to have all of you back, because we're going to try and continue this kind of programming. And just wanted to let everybody know about Reunion and to come back for Reunion.
And thank you for your leadership and great work.
Thanks.
Greg Meister, you have the last question, and we have about 4 minutes.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to see you again. As I said in the breakout room, when we were in college freshman year, I regarded you as scary smart and actually thought you were one of the teachers. And it's good to see you in this context. The last time I saw you, we shared a hot tub in Daly City, which you may or may not remember. My question is, when you came to Williams, you were already deeply political and more aware of some of these issues than many of us. How did you arrive at your understanding, and then what prompted you on what you called your downward path?
The short answer, as Lenny knows intimately well, the short answer is that my family had relocated from California to Afghanistan, where my father worked for CARE. And this was before the Soviet War. This was before the disaster and catastrophe that befell Afghanistan over 3 generations. It was the early 60s. And I came from there. I hadn't been there even a year, but I was there in what would have been my senior year in high school. And that shook me to my core. I'd never seen poverty like that. It wasn't politics in the way that you're meaning it, just it's a confrontation with the world in a way that I had never experienced it before. And I do think that at Williams, I can't imagine having been there and engaging in the conversations we all had it not also been for the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. If I kind of frame what my life was actually like for what we shared together, there was in the classroom, then there were the endless, long, interminable conversations about the war and about civil rights. And that deeply affected a lot of us, I think. And it wasn't part of the college's official curriculum, right? But it was part of our official lives. And it was who we were as young people. And I'm deeply indebted to, classmates, and some of our junior advisor types who engaged me and wouldn't let me get away with sophomoric, things and try to think about something serious, what's going on. So I do think that the college, we were lucky that we were during a time when I think that those external movements became part of the text of our lives. And I taught at the University of California and at Merritt College in Oakland, a community college, during the height of those movements. And those conversations were enlivened by the external world in a way that I then found later teaching at a place like Santa Clara to be more difficult, because the external world wasn't constantly demanding of the students that they engage the questions of inequality, race, class, dare I say it, imperialism. They weren't being forced to think about that in the way that I think a lot of us were. I think we were lucky.
So, Dr. Brian Murphy, on behalf of your friends and classmates, we can't thank you enough for spending the time with us, and I really appreciate it. I'm glad you found a parking space, because it would have been a dull evening if we tried to fill in for you.
Larry,
thanks to everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for showing up. I really
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you all for coming too.
Good job.
It was a great evening this evening, and we really appreciate
Good
it.
night, Jim Lenheim.
Good night, everybody.
Greg Meister.
Thanks, John. Hey, Mark.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
All right.
Hmm.